Welcome back. Thanks for watching PCNC. I'm Lenny McAllister. Dr. Linden, one of the things that's very interesting about this dynamic in regards to the Greeks owing so much money to specific debtors is the fact that one of the debtors involved in this is Germany. So now you're starting to hear the Greeks kind of try to throw out there, oh, and by the way, didn't we do this previously? Wasn't their debt forgiven previously? Wasn't Nazi Germany the cause for a lot of different things 60, 70 years ago that we basically ignored and forgiven and went along those lines? And shouldn't we leverage this? In fact, there was a headline that came out earlier this week basically having the Greek government quoting how much Germany owes Greece now. So I understand that some of this ends up being desperate measures. But when you start having the type of tumultuous history that Europe has had, it's been relatively quiet over the last 30 years. But from the Cold War back to the beginning of the 20th century, you have a lot of countries that were going at each other for multiple periods of time. Are we at a risk now of that starting to percolate once again because there's so much economic and thus societal tension coming into play?
Indeed, the history for Europeans happened yesterday, not a long time ago, and they remember it, and you've seen the caricatures of Frau Merkel, and a lot of the debate quickly turns into stereotypes, by the way, on both sides, the lazy Greeks,
yep,
the austere Germans. In a curious way, I think this helps the current government in Greece because they get to let people blame it on the Germans. The Germans are the most austere. Everybody knows they're the ones that are holding their feet to the fire. Okay, I wouldn't do this to you, says the Prime Minister, but it's those nasty Germans. He doesn't say it in those terms, but in a way it helps him. By the way, it also helps him to blame it on the Europeans, on the Eurozone. So in a way it can help, but of course it can get nasty.
So they're basically being outsiders but also part of the Eurozone at the same exact time. And basically,
who's an outsider?
Oh, basically, the Greeks are able to say, okay, we're outsiders because the people that are actually running this are forcing us into these measures, but we don't want to leave the Eurozone at the same exact time.
That's right. Why would they? They get tremendous advantages by being in the Eurozone. They've benefited up until the crash of 2008, when, by the way, many European countries suffered from the crash, which, if I recall, started in the United States. But it's true. They have huge benefits. They want to keep it, and they want austerity to stop hurting.
Well, there are others, including Europe and the Chinese, that will remind us that all of that stuff in 2008 did start in the United States, which then gets us over to Greece. When people are talking about all these situations going on now in Greece, the bond ratings, from what I have read, are starting to slowly creep back up. It's not the free fall that it was 5 years ago, which means that at some point in time, maybe we'll get back to where they need to be. But is that a 10-year project, a 20-year project? What does that look like, and how is that going to impact basically a generation of not just those living in Greece and not just those living in the Eurozone, but the global economy, one where you're having new players come to the forefront?
Sure. I think it's probably about a 10-year process for Greece. I think, and you alluded to this a little bit, the more interesting question is, what if this plays out in China, which is an economy obviously much larger and more potent than a much larger player on the world stage.
They've had their problems over the last month or so, yes.
They've had their problems as well, and if you talk about the cycle of booms and busts, they've had a fairly impressive boom, which might lead you to think they're due for a fairly impressive bust. So that's an interesting question that'll play out elsewhere in the world. As it pertains to Greece and Europe, I think it's been advantageous to both sides to have Germany be the bad cop here. I think the Europeans see Germany as the good cop and France as the good cop, and that's sort of the negotiating ploy they've taken. And like Dr. Linden said, the Greeks are able to say, oh, it's the Greek government can say it's the Germans, they're making us do it, which is why Tsipras has come back to the Greek parliament today with basically the same deal that was rejected by his voters, and it's probably going to get approved because he can say, look, it's the Germans, they're going to hold our feet to the fire on this one.
So let me ask you this, Dr. Davies. With that said, with the protests that have been out there for quite some time, for over 5 years now, between that and their feet being held to the fire, is this something that the Greek government will not only leverage for the time being to get the deal that they need, but moving forward will be able to say, and this is what we must do to get out of this over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, not just to get us through and open up the banks for the next 18 months?
Oh, certainly. I would be surprised if they would say something about the next 5 to 10 years, because my guess is after this bailout comes along, we're going to be talking 2 or 3 years before the next one has to come along. So we're going to be saying, well, same thing all over again. I think it's useful to look at it from Germany's perspective because, on the one hand, you see this wealthy Germany, why can't it loan some extra money to help Greece come along? So look at it from Germany's perspective. Greece's debt is about 4 times the size of its government's income. So that's like a household with a $50,000 income having $200,000 on its credit card. Now, if you're the bank, you're going to be kind of loath to extend credit to this guy, understandably so.
But it's actually what everybody does. It's not like having $200,000 on your credit card. It's like having a $200,000 mortgage, which everybody has.
But it's not, because there's no asset on the other side. With a mortgage, I've got a house that you can look at.
But then the question goes to this. Who can take advantage of the situation? I want to get to that when we come back from break. Who's going to be able to sit there and say, okay, well, if we help you out, this is what we're going to get out of this, whether it's the Germans or anybody else in the Eurozone, or even, dare I say, the Americans. We'll see how that plays out. We'll ask these guys that question when we come back here on Night Talk.